Okay. Well, I think we got it all put together here finally. There's about a half a dozen different buttons that I got to push to get all these recordings done, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But I think we're good to go here tonight. I want to welcome everybody here tonight to the. We're going to start getting almost to the end of all of the prophecies and the judgments and stuff like that, and then we're going to get into the fun stuff, the futuristic prophecies of what's going to happen, and that's always a lot of fun. And then, of course, doing the Ezekiel's temple, that's good too. So I'm looking forward to that. But we got this week and next week we're going to be doing the 4 chapters that deal with the judgment against Egypt. So let's go ahead and begin with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in the words of Torah. Man. All right. Now, going back through all of the stuff. Here we are right now. We're just coming in on this judgment on Egypt. And we got 2 chapters tonight. We're going to try to run through 2 chapters tonight. So there's a lot of repetition, and it's not really theologically very deep, but historically we just need to go through those things this week and next week. So I'm going to try to get through this tonight. I wanted to get 2 chapters this week and 2 chapters next week. So here we go. Now, I wanted to show you this thing here. This is the Merneptah stele. I can't ever say that word. It's a stele or stele. Anyway, somebody can figure that one out for me, but depends on whether you're American, Texan, or a Brit, how you pronounce it. Anyway, Ezekiel, he concludes his oracles against the foreign nations with actually 7 messages that the Lord gave him concerning the fate of Egypt. And, he had already 6 messages for the other nations, but now he's got 7 oracles, and all of them against Egypt. And Egypt, of course, is one of Israel's most ancient and powerful enemies. And so there had always been a lot of interaction between them. So the 7 oracles against Egypt are actually as lengthy as the preceding 6 oracles against all the other nations were. And I tell you what, let me go ahead and mute everybody. I forgot to do that. And if you want to say something, just unmute yourself. But that keeps the background noise down and so forth. So anyway, this 4 chapters against Egypt is as long as all of the other 6 nations combined, against Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, Tyre, and Sidon. But like also Jeremiah, he put a lot of effort and a lot of interest in Egypt, and mostly is because Egypt played a very large role in Judean affairs, during this time frame. So God controls, and often it's kind of loosely, but he's definitely there in charge. And so everything that happened, of course, is according to God's plan. What happens to Israel's most famous or notorious antagonist, I guess you'd say, was Egypt. So Ezekiel's prophecy concerning Egypt assumes that it has a very elaborate form, because he regards the power of Pharaoh in Egypt as the embodiment of a phase of the imperial power, which imagines itself, Pharaoh did, in its ungodly self deification. They thought themselves as gods, and so when you do that, God takes notice of it, and it's just not a good thing. It doesn't end well for the person. So most of these things are going to be in chronological order. However, there are two, and when we get to chapter 29 and verse 17 to 21, that one is a little bit out of order. And then later in 31, and that one, chapter 30 and 1 through 19, that's a little out of order too. And so they're undated. And so we have I've put this chart out here to just kind of give us a timeline. And, we've got something very important up here is Babylon's defeat of Egypt at Carcamesh. And that was, Carcamesh is up in the Euphrates, up on the Euphrates River. I mean, it's way the heck up there. And Egypt had gone way out. Their supply chain was their resupplies and all that kind of stuff pretty thin. Well, anyway, they got beat pretty badly, and basically it just destroyed, for the most part, Egypt's ability to do a whole lot. And later on, we'll see in the prophecies it talks about Egypt's broken arm. And so, that was in 605, and then here we got just a few years later. Then this is the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's second siege of Jerusalem, and so you'll see the time frames. And of course, to get it all in perspective, we see the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple was here in 586 BCE. And if you're like me, looking at these the dates when they're in the BCE, before the Common Era, of course they're in descending order instead of ascending order, and so that always messes me up in trying to remember.
Okay. Excuse me. I just told Charles I don't understand those dates. They're un-American.
Well, yeah,
they confuse me.
They confuse me too, because we get 605 was you got the Common Era, and then you just start counting backwards. And 605 is out here, and then 586 is here, and then 400 is here, 300 there, 200. And finally, you get to the Common Era. But it's just backwards, and so it's kind of hard for us to think in those terms, because we don't do it very often. So anyway, here we go. Let's I gotta get started, because this is going to be a whirlwind tour tonight. On the 12th day of the 10th month of the 10th year, the word of Adonai came to me, saying, "Son of man, set your face against Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Prophesy against him and against all Egypt." Now, this is another date. It's dated, okay, and write something, because my what do you call that? ADHD or something? I don't know what they call it. Stuff just kicked in. I see a misspelling in my notes. All right, so this is another dated prophecy. it came to Ezekiel in the year before his first oracle against Tyre, actually. All right, so this one came before Tyre, and so this is when they count back, the scholars make it January 7th, 587 BCE. Okay, so the Lord directed his prophet to turn his attention to the south, to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and actually to all of Egypt, and announce this message of judgment. And so, with a lot of prophecies that we see when they talk about the king of this or the king of that, that the king is actually a figure of speech. The word is a metonym for his nation, meaning when you say this judgment against the king of Egypt, well, this is also a judgment against the people or the nation of Egypt. All right, so speak and say, thus says Adonai Elohim, behold, I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, a great crocodile lying in his rivers, who says, my Nile is my own, I made it for myself. I will put hooks in your jaws and make the fish of your streams stick to your scales. I will haul you out from within your rivers, and all the fish of your streams will stick to your scales. And I will leave you in the desert, you and all the fish of your streams. You will fall on the open field. You will not be gathered or picked up. I will give you as food for the beasts of the earth and for the birds of the sky. Wow, that's pretty graphic. And like the king of Tyre and all of his people, Pharaoh and Egypt they're guilty of pride, and he became, metaphorically, they're like the great river monster. In Hebrew, it's Tanim, and they're probably it's translated here as a crocodile. And there were lots of crocs in the river Nile, and he was taking credit for the river, and these pharaohs would do those kind of things. They would point out to their people, see, if it wasn't for me, you wouldn't have this great river here. And so the Pharaoh calls himself a creator of the Nile, which is silly, but he paints himself as this creator of greatness in Egypt. And so this pride, in which he basically forgets God and attributes all of his divine power to himself, is the cause of the sin. And we saw, like with Tyre, that pride comes before the fall, and so it's a sin that now he's going to be overthrown by God. So Tanim it's a variant spelling of Tanim, is translated serpent, leviathan, sea monster in Old Testament times. But and sometimes they were talking, these were metaphorical animals, and so it also describes real animals too, as well as the mythological ones. And so in ancient Near Eastern mythology, this word referred to the monster of chaos that was destroyed in creation. And so Egyptians believed that Pharaoh conquered this chaotic monster. But here God called Pharaoh, he actually called Pharaoh this monster. He didn't destroy it. He was the monster. So rather than giving God thanks for the Nile as a resource, the king had actually claimed responsibility for himself. And so all of these pharaohs, they were in the same boat. They were proudful and prideful, and they took on themselves the trappings of being a god, of course, a little g god. The picture that I had of just up here a little bit before, this big tombstone here looking thing, down here at the bottom, right there, it talks about the talks about a invasion into Israel, and where that the king of the Pharaoh of Egypt talks about how he went in there and he stole all of Israel's grain. So this is important because this is one of the most ancient writings that that actually it shows that yes, there actually was an Israel, and people at these days that say that Israel did never existed, and this was not their home, and they're just interlopers and they're occupiers, and it's really the Palestinians' land. Well, that's bogus, because we got this piece of rock here has a carving, the letters in it that talks about the Pharaoh going in there and beating Israel and taking a lot of their grain away from them, stealing their harvest. So anyway, again, archaeology just goes to prove the Bible over and over again. So let's go ahead and on this scripture that we just read, it's almost pretty self-explanatory. God compares Pharaoh to the crocodile, and basically he's saying, I'm just going to pluck you out, pluck the people out, pluck the Pharaoh out of their comfort zone, out of their ability to make a living, and maybe to sustain themselves. Going to pull them out, throw them out into the desert, where what happens when you throw a fish out in the desert? It doesn't do very well for very long. So the question about whether the Egyptians were monotheistic, not at all. They had my goodness, and I think I mentioned it later on in some of my notes here.
So I guess my question is then, how could they forget God if they never?
Well, I mean, just look at it this way. Do you think that they knew that there was a God when all of the 10 plagues hit them? And this was 800 or 900 years prior.
Yeah.
And so they would have known there is a God in Israel, and he is powerful, and they would remember that. And but remember, the plagues, all of the plagues were focused on one of the gods, one of the many, the pantheon of gods that were in Egypt at the time. The Nile was a god, the frogs, the flies, the various things, and even down to the point of the firstborn. That was a thing that it was not a god per se, but it was the idea that the Pharaoh's son then becomes the Pharaoh, and therefore his son is a little g god until he grows up, and then he becomes a big G god, but he's still a little g god. And so every plague was designed to show the Egyptians that their gods were no match for the one true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So they were definitely not monotheistic at all. In fact, for the most of human history, Israel was the only religion in all the world that was monotheistic, that only had one God. If there were some other religions out there, I can't think of them right offhand, but there may be. But for the most part, Israel was the only monotheistic religion that there was. And so let's go ahead. Then all the inhabitants of Egypt will know that I am Adonai, because they were a staff of reed in the house to the house of Israel. When they took hold of you by the hand, you snapped and tore all of their shoulders. When they leaned on you, you broke and wrenched all their hips. That sounds a little bit funny to to us, but a staff that was a kind of an essential part of wilderness walking. And when you're walking over rough areas, and so and a lot of times when I'm walking out here on our property, and it's kind of rough or whatever, I have a staff that a walking stick, as it were. And when my grandchildren were all young, they would want to come out here and say, "Grandpa, let's go walking," So, and so we'd make the circuit, the 20 acres, and walk all around it. And so all of them, I had them all stacked up. I had 5 or 6, however many grandkids we had at the time, 4 or 5, I don't know. However many there were, I had that many walking sticks that looked kind of like Grandpa's walking stick, because everybody had to have one. And so, but having a stick, a good, strong stick was necessary, and it was also could be used as a weapon to fend things off. And if I had a walking stick just a few minutes ago that was any good, I might have been able to thump that water moccasin on the head and kill it, but I didn't, so I had to just shoot him. And so a walking stick needed to be strong. Wasn't something that would break at a moment's notice. And so that's what the Bible is talking about, is that Egypt was a staff of Cain. And if you've ever been around, some kind of grasses and straws and caves, they're stiff. A reed, that's the word I'm trying to think of. Like a reed in the grass, and so they're long and they're round and so forth, but they're not particularly strong. And so if you were to put pressure on it sideways, then it would break. And so that's what God is referring to here, that Egypt was just a cane. It broke off. And when Israel relied on Egypt, then Egypt was not at all worthy or strong enough, or maybe they just didn't even want to help Israel out, because they still wanted, they had designs on conquering Israel. So Egypt was not a real good ally, is what he's saying here. So whenever the Judahites relied on Egyptians as their supporting staff, then they would always crater under pressure. So that's what God is going after them here for. So verse 8, therefore thus says Adonai Elohim, behold, I will bring a sword against you. I will cut off from you man and beast. The land of Egypt will become desolate and waste. Then they will know that I am Adonai, because he said, the Nile is mine, I made it. Again, referring back to Pharaoh. Therefore, behold, I am against you and against your rivers. I will make the land of Egypt an utter waste and desolation, from Migdol to Syene, as far as the borders of Ethiopia. No human foot will pass through it, and no foot of beast will pass through it. It will be uninhabited for 40 years. I will make the land of Egypt a desolation among devastated countries. Her cities will be a desolation 40 years among ruined cities. I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations and disperse them throughout the countries. For thus says Adonai Elohim, in the end of 40 years, I will gather the Egyptians from the peoples where they were scattered. All right. So I didn't advance that. Okay. So as a punishment, God was going to bring war into Egypt. That's the reference to the sword. And that, a lot of people, there would be a heavy loss of blood. And so Egypt would become desolate and a wasteland, and people would learn that, the Lord is God. So the Lord repeated that he would devastate Egypt for her pride and self-sufficiency, and the entire country, the whole country, everything, a part of it, would suffer, even down to the border of Ethiopia, which is at the extreme southern end of Egypt. And so Egypt then wouldn't be inhabited for 40 years, and that the other nations around them would also share the desolation. So her cities would lie in waste, and her people would disperse among the nations and live in other countries. Egypt's fate was actually like a repetition of Israel's in the wilderness. And so there's one of the commentators, Keel and Delich, they understood the number 40 to be symbolic of a period of punishment and penitence, and not a literal 40-year period. And I don't know why they could say that. I mean, the people are always doing that, where something in the Bible says it in black and white, and then they'll come along and say, well, that's not exactly what it means, even though it says it in black and white, 40 years. And so, but, Egypt did, that fell to the Egyptians. Egypt fell to the Babylonians in 568 and 567 BC. So at the end of the 40 years, the Lord promised to gather the Egyptians back to their original land, and from the countries where they were, that had been sent. And the Egyptians would no longer be this powerful nation. They would be a lowly nation. They would not have the ability to wage war, and so they were no longer a world powerhouse. And it's kind of like we see empires like that from history, that the Assyrian Empire is no longer a world dominating thing. The Babylonians are not. Egyptians are not. Rome, Italy is not. Greece, and Alexander the Great, Greece is no longer a world power. And much as we don't like to admit it, though, Britain is no longer a world power. They used to rule the world, really. I mean, they ruled commerce and many other things. But now today they're pretty much just I wouldn't say a backwater nation, but they're not nearly as powerful as they had been. And it's just that's the nature of history. So Egypt never did recover from that period of power. Now, the problem, there is no extra biblical evidence that substantiates this 40-year period. So we don't really know when it was, how it happened. There's really no documentations. They haven't found any plaques or something that talked about it. And so the commentators, they're all over the place. And I read several that one guy was even saying that, yeah, well, it never happened, and Ezekiel and Jeremiah were false prophets and they should have been stoned, and so there's just and I look at this and say, well, we may be missing something here. I'm not real sure what it is that we may be missing, but it's possible, that this stuff did happen, But you know how nations were back in those days. They're certainly not going to chronicle their failures, and that they were all sent out into exile. So, any comments or questions so far? In verse 14, it says, I will restore the fortunes of Egypt. I will cause them to return to the land of Pathros, the land of their origin. But they will be a lowly kingdom, and there it will be the lowliest of the kingdoms. It will no longer exalt itself above the nations. I will diminish them so that they no longer rule over the nations. It will no longer be as security for the house of Israel, bringing to mind the iniquity of their turning after them. So they will know that I am Adonai. So here's God is saying, okay, I'm going to bring them back, but they're not going to be as powerful as they were. It's just not going to be a world powerhouse anymore. And so, in fact, they never did. After Alexander the Great came into power, and then he died and split up the empire, split up the world into four groups, and the Ptolemies were basically in charge of Egypt. Then even so, I mean, they were a part, or a large part, a quarter of the Greek Empire, but they never did. They were never able to take advantage of that and then consolidate all the power of the Greek Empire. So, 40 years after Egypt fell to the Babylonians, the Persians, who at that time defeated the Babylonians, allowed the Egyptians to return to their homeland. So this was a foreign policy, but there again, we don't have a lot of information about that time frame. So, like I said, we don't have any extra biblical evidence yet, and someday there may be. So, going ahead in verse 17, on the first day of the first month of the 27th year. It's a long time, because the other things that he was talking about was in the 10th year, the 11th year. So now he's gone up to the 27th year. The word of Adonai came to me, son of man, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, made an army labor hard against Tyre. Every head became bald and every shoulder chafed. But he and his army had no profit from Tyre for the labor that he had expended against it. Therefore, says Adonai Elohim, behold, I will give the land of Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. He will carry off her abundance, and take her spoil, and take her prey. It will be the wages for his army. And I have given him the land of Egypt as his wages, for which he served, because they worked for me. It's a declaration of Adonai in that day I will cause a horn to shoot up for the house of Israel. I will open your mouth among them. They will know that I am Adonai. All right, so this one's a little tough too, to explain everything. Ezekiel, he received this message from the Lord about Egypt's judgment on April 26th, 571 BC, and which was, what did it say? It was the first day of the first month. It was on the, and remember, that's not what we call Rosh Hashanah. It was the first day, that's the first of Nisan, is what he would be talking about there, which would be like 2 weeks before Passover. So that was in 571. So this is probably the second to the last recorded prophecy of Ezekiel, because it is very, very much later. And the prophet would have been about 50 years old at this time. So the writer here evidently inserted this prophecy or this oracle in the text here to group it with the other prophecies against Egypt. So rather than being, like consecutive or putting everything right in place, he stuck it in there with the Egyptian prophecies. That's the way cataloged it, categorized it. So the placement here informs the reader that the destruction of Egypt foretold in the first message would come through Nebuchadnezzar. So that enables us then to understand the remaining oracles against Egypt. So the Lord revealed to Nebuchadnezzar that it was going to be, the Lord revealed to Ezekiel that it was going to be Nebuchadnezzar as God's instrument of judgment. And, he had worked very hard, 13 years. He had a siege against Tyre. And so when it talks about every head had a bald spot and every shoulder was rubbed raw, that describes the chafing of helmets, where they had the helmets all the time, and the carrying of burdens in order to build the siege works. And so that was a very long and drawn out siege. As some, most sieges would take, 1, 2, 3 years, but this one was 13 years. I mean, that's almost a career. So Nebuchadnezzar didn't receive a lot of compensation for that. The spoil that he took, because most everything had been expended or gotten, they lost at sea or whatever. It really didn't pay for what he was doing. So the soldiers back in those days are not paid like today, where you just get a regular paycheck. They might get a little allowance along with their rations, but they wouldn't join the army for those kind of rations and an allowance. So basically, they had a special incentive system that made the army. Of course, it made them a whole lot more anxious to win, is because when the battles took place and there was a lot of wealth and concentrated and so forth, and to the spoil goes the victor. No, to the victor goes the spoils. And so they would, after defeating an enemy, the army would dig into the spoils and divide them up. And those that were fortunate enough to find gems, precious metals, and other great valuables in the possessions of the defeated enemies, they would become instantly rich, and hopefully they were good soldiers. Otherwise, they would become instantly dead, because somebody else would take it from them. So that would supplement their income quite handsomely. So, the Lord announced that he would give Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar as payment for executing his judgment against Tyre. And he would carry off the wealth of Egypt as spoil and plunder, because he had worked so hard in defeating Tyre. So there's maybe just a little bit of historical data that says Egypt and Tyre had become allies under the Pharaoh Hophra. And so that extended siege was probably possible because the Egyptians were able to somehow supply Tyre for a long time and keep them going. So later on, when Nebuchadnezzar defeated Egypt, the defeat then would provide hope for Israel, because Egypt was Israel's ancient enemy. So Nebuchadnezzar invaded and defeated Egypt about 568 to 567, somewhere in that time frame, and so said it would be as though a horn began to grow in Israel. Now, a horn that's a sign of new strength to come. It's also, the horn is a symbol of Messiah in some passage of scriptures, and then a branch in others. And so, but basically this context here that we're talking about, the horn, speaks of Israel surviving and gonna, they will at some time then become a nation again. So again, the commentators are all over the place with what the horn really meant, but I think it's pretty obvious that it means that Israel is going to be able to thrive again. So so the Lord had also promised to open Ezekiel's mouth then in the midst of all of the exiles. The Lord had restrained the prophet from speaking back in chapter 3:26, but he had resumed speaking, and the Israelites would be more open to messages from the Lord and more able to reassert or assert themselves, because their old nemesis Egypt now had suffered humiliations. All these events would teach people that of God's unique deity, and that he was the only God, the one and true God of the universe. And so this is basically one of the main lessons of the book of Ezekiel, is that God is all powerful. So let's go ahead down into we're going to go into chapter 30, and here I've spent 45 minutes on chapter 29, and I'm going to get 30 done in 15 minutes. So the word of Adonai came to me, saying, Son of man, prophesy, and thus says Adonai Elohim, wail, alas, for the day is near. The day of Adonai is near, a day of clouds, a time for the nations. So here, again, God is telling Ezekiel to do what he did with Tyre, to basically do a lament, or the funeral dirge, and he was to wail and bemoan that the day of the Lord was near. And so it would be a pretty dark day for several nations, because it involved judgment for them. And typically throughout the Bible, when it talks about the day of the Lord, that's talking about a day of judgment where God acts in a very, very dramatic way. And so normally when we talk about the day of the Lord, that's you see that in Revelation or other books of the Bible, where they're talking about the end times. It's more of an eschatological definition of the day of the Lord, but it talks about judgment. And this one here, though, is pretty focused. The day of the Lord was going to be the judgment of Egypt. And then down it also said that this is a time for the nations, and that is the allied forces of Nebuchadnezzar going into Egypt. Now, the sword will come against Egypt, and anguish will be in Ethiopia when the slain fall in Egypt. They will take away her abundance. Her foundations will be torn down. Ethiopia, Lud, all of the mixed people, Libya, and the children of the covenant land will fall with them by the sword. Thus says Adonai Elohim, those who support Egypt will fall. The pride of her power will collapse from Migdal to Saim, and they will fall within her by the sword. It's a declaration of Adonai. All right, so here we have, again, kind of a repeat of what they had said before, that God was going to come in and destroy Egypt all the way down. Now, remember, this is a lament. This is not the prophecy. This part is Hebraically, and the wording here and the structure is in the literary structure of a funeral dirge. So that's why, even though they're saying the same thing, it's not exactly the same thing.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Can you back up one slide real quick? In modern times, where is Migdal and Sin?
That basically, let's see. It refers to the north and the south, the east and the west. I mean, these were just major cities when they talk about Ethiopia, Cush, and Nubia, and Put is on the African coast of the southern Red Sea. Lud or Lydia in Anatolia. That's actually in western Turkey, and so. Basically, what they're saying is in all of this that Nebuchadnezzar is doing, all of that whole area of the Babylonian Empire where Nebuchadnezzar is taking over, it wasn't just restricted to Egypt. It was everything around Egypt also. So I mean,
Okay.
it basically
So
said
encompass more than just Egypt, encompass a larger area. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
but certainly it encompassed all of Egypt and then the surrounding nations too. So anyway, there's so when it's talking about the sword, of course, it's obvious that that's war. It will extend south to Ethiopia, where even the Ethiopians are saying, you know, they're scared because this war is really coming around them. And the surrounding nations and the Jews who fled to Egypt would also suffer. During the siege of Israel, there was a pretty sizable group of Jews that fled. They got away, and they settled down in Egypt. In fact, I think even Jeremiah eventually got down there to them. And so when Nebuchadnezzar did come through, he spared very few people, and so even the Jews that gotten away from the siege of Babylon, then it caught up to them down there in Egypt too. You have to also remember that the people that fled from the Babylonian siege, they were not particularly good people. In fact, they had killed the governor that Nebuchadnezzar put in charge, a guy named Gedaliah, who was reportedly a pretty decent Jewish man that was going to govern things that while during the exile. But then a bunch of people killed him, and then they had to flee, and so they got theirs in the end. But getting back to what we were saying, Jason had said there that all of Egypt, everything, all of the Egypt and any country that was allied with them would suffer. So they will be desolate among desolate lands. Her cities will be among ruined cities. They will know that I am Adonai when I have set a fire in Egypt and all her supporters destroyed. On that day, messengers will go out from before me in ships to frighten Ethiopians out of complacency. Anguish will come on them as on the day of Egypt, for behold, it is coming. All right, the people and the cities of Egypt would become desolate. So the Egyptians, so that the Egyptians would know that Adonai is God. And when he destroyed the land, as with a fire, in war, fire, war. I mean, it's a metaphor there. And he basically rendered Egypt's allies ineffective when they tried to help her. The day of the Lord in verse 3 and the day of Egypt's judgment, they're one and the same. God would send soldiers against Israel, against Egypt in ships. They would come around and they would be able to go up the Nile River. Actually, that would be going south of the Nile River, but they could go in the Nile River on these ships and strike very far inland that way. So you kind of get the picture where Egypt was definitely going to come under some very heavy judgment. Thus says Adonai Elohim, I will put away the pomp of Egypt by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. He and his people with him, the ruthless of the nations, will be brought in to destroy the land. They will draw their swords against Egypt and will fill the land with the slain. I will make the rivers dry. I will sell the land into the hands of evildoers. I will make the land desolate and all that is in it by the hand of strangers. I, Adonai, have spoken. So this is a third message here. That the Lord has said he would kill many Egyptians when he sent who? Nebuchadnezzar against Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar would come with all of his allies. They would fight Egypt with a large consolidated army, and he would kill a lot of people in Egypt. So God would cause the canals of the Nile River to dry up as a result of the warfare, and the irrigation canals in Egypt required, these are irrigation ditches, so they would fill in. If you didn't have people to keep dredging them out and so forth, they would eventually be of no use because they would spill all the water at the wrong time. They couldn't hold the water. And so as a result, the agricultural systems of Egypt would fail. And so the Babylonians, of course, they didn't know anything about that kind of stuff. So, when they got down there, they looked at these irrigation ditches and so forth, and that was something that was foreign to them. And so they didn't do anything with it. And of course, then everything just fell apart. And that's what they're talking about with that, causing the rivers to dry up. And then the title, basically, is going to sell the land to evildoers, sell the land to people who had no interest in sustaining Egypt. All right, so it says, thus says Adonai Elohim, I will destroy the idols, I will destroy the pagan gods from Noph. There will no longer be a prince in the land of Egypt. I will strike terror in the land of Egypt. I will make Pathros desolate. I will set a fire in Zoan. I will execute judgments in No. And I will pour my fury on Sin, the stronghold of Egypt. I will cut off the multitude of No. I will set a fire in Egypt. Sin will writhe in anguish. No one will be assaulted. Noph will face enemies daily. The young men of Aven and Pibeseth will fall by the sword, and the women will go into captivity. Tahapnehes, I tried saying that one. Okay. The day in Tahapnehes, the day will grow dark when I break the yokes of Egypt there. The pride of her power will cease in her. A cloud will cover her. Her daughters will go into captivity, so I will execute judgments in Egypt, and they will know that I am Adonai. So what we have here, finally, the Lord has, he also promised to destroy the idols of Egypt, even from Noph. That's Memphis, what we call Memphis today, the capital of Lower Egypt, near the modern Cairo. And some studies indicate that there were more than 1,200 gods in Egypt. So there's your answer there, Carmen. More than 1,200 gods in Egypt at one time. There would no longer be a king over Egypt either. Foreigners would rule the land, and so the Egyptians then would be very fearful. They had regarded their Pharaoh, for hundreds and hundreds of years as the incarnation of a god, and now they had none. So was there no God in Egypt? And so countries in those days looked to their national god for protection, and many times their national god was the ruler, whoever that was. And so basically all of these gods were defeated just by virtue of the fact that Egypt was defeated. And so the women would be taken into captivity, and they would eventually understand it. They would know that God is in control. And when he's talking about the stronghold of sin, or sin, sin, the Greek word for it is Pelusium, and it's one of the northernmost strongholds of Egypt. And then said he would allow the walls of No, which is Thebes, to be breached and his people killed. Noph, which is in Memphis, would also experience daily distress during the war. So, and then on or Aven, that's in the Greek, we would know it as Heliopolis. That was a major religious center down in lower Egypt. And then there was another Pivaseth, which that's another capital city that was 40 miles northeast of the modern Cairo today. All of them would fall in war, and the Egyptian women would be carried off and the men would be killed. And so it definitely was a dark day for those cities and for the nation of Israel. But God was going to break their power. So on the 7th day of the first month of the 11th year, so we're the word of Adonai came to me saying, "Son of man, I have broken the arm of the Pharaoh, king of the Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Behold, it has not been bound up to be healed or put in a splint, so that it's wrapped up with a bandage to grow strong and wield the sword." So this next thing that he's talking about, that occurred on the 29th of April, 587 BCE. And that is less than actually 4 months after the Lord gave him the first oracle, which was in 29:1. So the Lord announced that he had broken Pharaoh's arm. Now, what does that mean? It's the strong arm of Egypt now had their arm broken. Well, if you got a broken arm, you can't wield a sword. And if you could and tried to wield a sword with your left hand, you would not be nearly as proficient. And this may refer to Egypt's defeat at Carcamesh in 605, when Egypt was defeated and their army destroyed. And so basically that arm was broken. And so now there's other possibilities, but it was an idea when I think we can all agree that when they talk about the arm broken, that was the defeat of a major military aspect of Egypt. And so now it says, "Therefore, thus says Adonai Elohim, I am against Pharaoh, king of Egypt. I will break his arms, the strong one and the one that was broken. I will cause the sword to fall out of his hand. I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations and disperse them through the countries." So God is again saying, I am against Egypt, as if we didn't already know. He says, I'm going to break that other arm. We broke the one arm, up in Carcamesh, and now I'm going to break this other arm, and Egypt will basically lose their all ability to wage war. They never would gain that strength again to be able to wage war. And so finally, I will strengthen the arms of the king of Babylon and put my sword in his hand. I will break the arms of Pharaoh so that he will groan before him like a fatally wounded man. I will strengthen the arms of the king of Babylon, but Pharaoh's arms will fall, so they will know that I am Adonai when I put my sword in the hand of the king of Babylon and he stretches it out against the land of Egypt. I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations and disperse them through the countries. Then they will know that I am Adonai. So, once again, we see that Babylon is God's agent. And so this Nebuchadnezzar would break Hophra. That's one of the other, a later Egyptian pharaoh, break Hophra's arms as they battle. Basically, again, metaphorically, he's going to destroy Egypt's ability to fight. And so, and like a wounded soldier who's had both of his arms broken, he just stands there groaning because now all that's left for him was just death or torture or mutilation or whatever. And the Lord says, okay, and I will continue to strengthen Babylon. So Babylon is getting stronger and Egypt is getting weaker. Ironically, one of the symbols in Egypt of their might and their power and the Pharaoh and everything was the arm like this, possibly even holding a sword, and that the huge biceps, kind of like today when we see these guys that they're going around there with their great big biceps and shoulders. But then you look at them and they're on pencil legs because they don't work their legs. Well, anyway, the big biceps of Egypt was destroyed, and so again, pride comes before the fall. All right, so are there any comments or questions? Because that pretty well closes it out for this evening. We did get through 2 chapters. Next week, we're going to try to do it again. Okay, Carmen.
Well, yeah, I just want to say thank you. I always do, but I learned a lot here. Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. Any other comments or questions that you might have? Because not, I'm gonna go ahead and close the recording, and then that way, if somebody does have a question, they can ask it.